late November 1944. The air over the Ruhr River Valley smells of wet earth, cordite, and burnt diesel. The defenders meticulously log the confirmed kills, noting the grid coordinates of the wrecks, and pass the triumphant numbers up the chain of command via field telephone, a permanent casualty, safely removed from the tactical equation. They could not comprehend that a muddy clearing just 5 miles away was currently functioning with the rapid, grinding efficiency of a Detroit assembly line. The ordnance detachments turned catastrophic combat damage into a mere logistical delay. But an assembly line is only as effective as its supply chain. Swapping a ruined radial engine for a fresh one requires having a massive, crated radial engine sitting in a muddy forest in western Germany. Rebuilding a severed suspension system requires hundreds of heavy steel track blocks and perfectly machined road wheels. A mobile factory cannot simply conjure thousands of pounds of precision machinery out of the winter fog. The mechanics had the skill, the specialized tools, and the heavy cranes, but they were ultimately at the mercy of physical inventory. How did the armored division ensure that a grease-covered mechanic working blindly in a freezing forest always had the exact, perfectly fitting part he needed the moment a broken tank arrived? A heavy 6x6 supply truck grinds its gears, tires spinning in the freezing slush of the ordnance depot before dropping its tailgate. Out slides a massive wooden crate, its damp pine boards heavily stenciled with black serial numbers. When the mechanics pry the lid off with a crowbar, they find a freshly manufactured heavy-duty transmission, heavily coated in thick, protective cosmoline grease. The tactical threat is officially declared eliminated. The frontline troops can finally stand down and rest, confident in a universal assumption of modern combat. This wooden crate represents the invisible mechanism that allowed the forward repair system to function. The American mechanic unbolting a shattered gear housing does not need to measure the mounting brackets on the replacement. He already knows, with absolute certainty, that it will drop flawlessly into the empty steel cavity. This mechanical certainty was born from the ruthless standardization of American wartime industry. A heavy drive sprocket cast in a foundry in Michigan fit perfectly onto a suspension bogie machined in Ohio, which was bolted to a hull assembled in Detroit. The manufacturing tolerances were strictly uniform across thousands of miles of civilian assembly lines. There was no need for custom filing, custom grinding, or specialized calibration in a muddy European forest. When the new transmission was lowered by the M32's crane, the heavy steel bolt holes aligned instantly. The mechanic applied the torque wrench, the bolts bit into the threads, and the 30-ton machine was whole again. Across the line of contact, the German maintenance crews faced a vastly different, deeply frustrating reality. German heavy armor, such as the Panther and the Tiger, were sophisticated masterpieces of ballistic engineering, but they were manufactured more like bespoke luxury vehicles than mass-produced tools. Their production runs were constantly interrupted by minor design tweaks. The enemy will need at least a week, perhaps 2, to requisition, transport, and integrate replacement vehicles from the distant, overloaded ports on the French coast. Continuous upgrades and factory-level modifications. If a German frontline crew managed to receive a replacement final drive, they often discovered that the mounting flanges did not perfectly match the specific hull sitting in their workshop. To make the new component fit, the German mechanic might have to hand-file the heavy steel, or send the entire crippled vehicle backward to a specialized railhead facility equipped with heavy milling machines. What took an American ordnance crew 6 hours in the freezing rain could take a German maintenance company 2 weeks. The defending force was fighting a war of artisanal craftsmanship, inherently vulnerable to the slightest disruption. The Allied forces were fighting a war of interchangeable volume, The supply chain, stretching from the beachheads in Normandy to the winter lines in Germany, was not carrying custom solutions. It was an iron river of universal spare parts. Every mechanic carried heavy, grease-stained manuals listing universal stock numbers. If a specific road wheel was shattered by shrapnel, a standardized replacement was requisitioned, loaded onto a truck, and driven straight into the mud. This industrial discipline turned a battered armored division into a regenerating organism. If a tank was crippled by enemy fire, war, as understood by the men in the bunkers, is a simple, irreversible equation of subtraction. When a complex steel machine is broken on the front line, the logistics network merely pushed the standardized replacement pieces to the mobile factory floor. It was a perfectly balanced ecosystem of rigid manufacturing logic and brutal frontline labor. But balancing an ecosystem is relatively simple when the front line remains entirely static. In the bitter, grinding stalemate of a winter defensive line, the forward ordnance detachments could plant their heavy cranes in the mud and wait for the M32 recovery vehicles to drag the broken tanks to them. The true test of a logistical system is not how it performs at rest. It is how it survives when the entire theater of war abruptly shifts into high gear. When an armored division finally shatters the defensive line and begins advancing 30, 40, or 50 miles a day, the heavy repair depots cannot stay behind in a quiet forest. How could a massive, sprawling industrial operation pack up its cranes and keep pace with a fluid, chaotic breakthrough without collapsing under its own weight? When an armored division shatters the enemy line and breaks out into open country, the fundamental physics of the battlefield change. The grinding, static artillery duels of a winter stalemate are replaced by a roaring, dust-choked sprint. It is gone forever. But 48 hours later, the deep, rhythmic vibration of heavy engines returns to the valley floor. During a major offensive, a mechanized column might cover 30, 40, or even 50 miles in a single day. At this speed, enemy anti-tank fire is no longer the only threat. The sheer friction of continuous driving begins to destroy the vehicles from the inside out. Transmissions overheat, radial engines blow gaskets, and heavy steel track pins snap under the relentless vibration of rough cobblestone roads. If the heavy ordnance maintenance companies remained safely parked in the rear, the advancing combat battalions would quickly outrun their own lifelines. A Sherman disabled by a shattered drive sprocket would be left stranded 50 miles behind the front, effectively abandoning 30 tons of combat power to the rear echelon. To survive a fluid, chaotic breakthrough, the mobile factory floor had to pack up its heavy cranes, load its arc welders into the trucks, and chase the war. The military solved the problem of speed through a doctrine of echeloned triage and relentless leapfrogging. When a tank broke down or took a disabling hit during a rapid advance, it was not immediately dragged backward. Instead, the M32 recovery vehicles assigned to the frontline combat battalions simply towed the deadweight to the nearest hardball road or designated intersection. The recovery crew unhooked the cables, marked the map coordinates, and immediately raced forward to catch up with the fighting column. As the dawn fog thins and visibility clears, the German defenders stare back at the exact same ridge they defended 2 days prior. They deliberately left behind a trail of crippled steel resting on the shoulders of the main supply routes. Hours later, the heavy maintenance battalions followed the exact same path. Driving in massive convoys of cargo trucks and heavy wreckers, these depot crews operated like a traveling industrial circus. When they encountered a cluster of abandoned Shermans waiting at a rural crossroads, the convoy abruptly halted. Within minutes, the trucks dropped their tailgates, the heavy cranes swung into position, and the roadside transformed into an impromptu factory. The mechanics worked with aggressive, synchronized speed. They swapped blown engines in the dust of a ruined village square. tightened suspension bolts while supply convoys bypassed them on dirt roads and fueled the repaired tanks from passing transport trucks. The moment the last heavy wrench was turned, the crews threw their tools into the truck beds, started their engines, and drove forward to find the next cluster of broken hulls. The newly repaired tanks simply fired up and merged directly into the next advancing combat column. This leapfrogging system pushed the men to the brink of physical collapse. Mechanics slept in the cabs of their moving trucks, their hands permanently stained black with grease, cordite, and hydraulic fluid. But the doctrine worked. The invisible assembly line stretched out over dozens of miles. The American armor is advancing again. It is not a different unit. It is not a fresh, untested division rotated into the line to replace the shattered one, bending under the immense pressure of the advance without snapping. The division maintained its combat mass not by avoiding damage, but by processing it while constantly moving forward. Yet, this relentless system of recovery and replacement relied on one fundamental assumption: that the disabled tank still vaguely resembled a machine. A shattered track or a destroyed gearbox could be replaced. But when a high-velocity enemy shell struck an internal ammunition rack, the resulting explosion ripped the turret from the turret ring and subjected the hull to thousands of degrees of heat. The metal warped, the internal mechanics melted into slag, and the vehicle became a completely unrecoverable, burned-out husk. When a tank was truly, undeniably dead, no mobile factory could save it. So, how did the division's logistical machine extract vital value from complete mechanical annihilation? A catastrophic ammunition fire leaves a distinct, horrifying signature on a battlefield. When a high-velocity enemy shell manages to penetrate a Sherman and ignite the heavy ammunition racks stored inside the sponsons, the resulting explosion produces an internal pressure wave so violent it physically lifts the 6-ton turret off its mounting ring. The ensuing fire burns at thousands of degrees, warping the thick armor plate, melting the solid rubber off the road, wheels, and turning the intricate internal machinery into a fused, unrecognizable mass of blackened slag. To a frontline infantryman, this smoking husk is Through the heavy optics of the anti-tank guns, the defenders can clearly make out the familiar silhouettes, the mud-caked olive-drab paint, and the same divisional bumper codes. Metal grave. It is the undeniable definition of a total write-off. There is no crane heavy enough or mechanic skilled enough to reverse the effects of a metallurgical meltdown. The machine is dead. But the heavy ordnance maintenance companies did not view even these catastrophic losses as complete defeats. To the mechanics, a destroyed tank was simply an unorganized pile of highly valuable, pre-manufactured components. When a vehicle was declared completely unrecoverable, it was not abandoned to the mud. It was dragged backward by the M32 recovery vehicles to a designated salvage clearing, a place unofficially known among the crews as the Cannibalization yard. Here, the mechanics transformed from field surgeons into scavengers, armed with heavy pry bars, sledgehammers, and cutting torches. They descended on the burned-out hulls in the freezing rain. They systematically stripped away anything the fire and shrapnel had failed to destroy. A kinetic impact might have annihilated the right side of the tank, but the left side often held perfectly intact suspension bogies, uncracked steel track blocks. The internal crew compartment might be a charred ruin, but a careful hand could extract undamaged radio receivers, unbent periscopes, and functioning .30 caliber machine gun mounts. This ruthless, organized cannibalization bypassed the entire transatlantic supply chain. Requisitioning a new radio receiver from a warehouse in England required paperwork, transport ships, cargo trucks, and weeks of waiting. Unbolting a surviving radio from a dead Sherman sitting 50 yards away, the force bearing down on their positions is attacking at near full operational strength. The 14 gaping holes in the American formation have been entirely erased. Took 20 minutes. Mechanics hammered out track pins coated in baked mud and ash, wiped them clean, and threw them directly onto the mobile factory shelves. Through this grim process, a completely destroyed tank rarely died in vain. Its salvaged organs were immediately transplanted into the wounded hulls of 3 or 4 other vehicles, keeping the rest of the fleet alive and moving forward. The division learned to sustain its own momentum by feeding directly on its own casualties. Nothing of mechanical value was ever willingly left in the mud for the opposing force to claim. The enemy could clearly see the ruined, turretless husks left scattered in the wake of the American advance. German frontline commanders diligently photographed them, logged the grid coordinates, and added them to their daily intelligence reports. To the German High Command, these burnt steel carcasses were absolute proof that the Allied armored spearheads were being decisively blunted. They relied heavily on these precise mathematical reports to allocate their own dwindling reserves. They saw the dead hulls, but they could not see the missing radios, the stripped road wheels, or the salvaged track pins already moving back toward the front lines inside freshly repaired tanks. This fundamental misunderstanding of what a battlefield casualty truly meant created a massive operational blind spot. The enemy mathematically proved they were winning the war of attrition, yet the tactical maps kept showing the exact same American divisions advancing. The German commanders' earlier calculations were not based on arrogance or poor observation. They were based on the visible, undeniable laws of the battlefield. The very next morning. Why could the most experienced defending army in Europe not mathematically account for this system, even after seeing its results month after month? Inside a dimly lit command bunker behind the German lines, an intelligence officer smooths out a tactical map and carefully adjusts the red grease pencil markings. He is compiling the daily situation report. On his desk sit the collected after-action reviews from the infantry battalions and anti-tank batteries. He tallies the confirmed kills, compares the total against the known establishment strength of the American Armored Division operating in his sector, and arrives at a deeply comforting mathematical conclusion. According to the ledger, the enemy formation has been practically annihilated. The German operational doctrine measured enemy combat power through strict, irreversible subtraction. If military intelligence identified a specific American division, they knew precisely how many Sherman tanks it theoretically possessed. Every smoking hull reported by a frontline battery was permanently crossed off that master list. Once the cumulative losses crossed a critical threshold, the German command officially downgraded the American unit's status. They believed they were fighting a war of finite numbers, slowly grinding the enemy down toward zero. The Allies, however, did not measure their strength through cumulative historical losses. They operated entirely on the concept of the daily operational readiness rate. From the damp concrete of a fortified observation post, a German battery commander lowers his binoculars, wipes the freezing rain from his face. He saw the kinetic impact of the shells strike home. He saw the heavy steel tracks break apart. He saw the panicked crews bail out. At 1800 hours every evening, an American armored commander did not ask his staff how many vehicles had been destroyed since the campaign began. He asked a single, immediate question: how many engines will turn over tomorrow morning? Because of the invisible recovery and repair system working furiously through the night, a division might suffer 50 tactical casualties over a brutal week of fighting, yet still report a combat readiness rate of 90% by Sunday. The German command could not mathematically account for this rapid regeneration because they were unconsciously projecting their own logistical reality onto the enemy. A German panzer division in the winter of 1944 functioned as a one-way street, deprived of specialized recovery vehicles, standardized spare parts, and reliable fuel routes. A damaged German tank was usually abandoned or deliberately blown up by its own crew to prevent capture. The German staff officers naturally assumed the Americans suffered from the exact same terminal friction. They could not conceive of a battlefield where the mechanical debris constantly repaired itself and cycled back into the line. This fundamental blindness resulted in disastrous tactical decisions. A German commander, trusting the meticulous math of his intelligence officers, would order a desperate counterattack against an American sector he was assured was completely hollowed out, of smoking hatches and retreat through the freezing rain. By every doctrinal standard he had been taught at the academy, those 30-ton machines were dead. The advancing German infantry would step out of the winter tree line, expecting to overrun a broken, demoralized remnant. Instead, they would walk directly into a solid wall of operational armor. The German maps were mathematically flawless, but operationally blind. On paper, the American system of recovery, repair, and replacement functioned with the cold, unstoppable efficiency of a mathematical equation. It appeared to the enemy as a mechanical miracle. But a system is not a machine. It does not run on paper, and it does not operate without friction. The meticulously updated readiness reports never recorded the physical toll extracted from the ordnance crews, keeping those numbers high. What was the true human cost demanded by this relentless, invisible factory? Let us return to the muddy ridge above the Roar River Valley in late November. When the German battery commander lowered his binoculars and stared at the resurrected American tanks breaking through the morning fog, he was not witnessing a failure of his gunners. His anti-tank crews had aimed true. The high-velocity shells had flown straight, shattering tracks and punching through engine compartments exactly as designed. The kinetic math of the ambush had been executed flawlessly. The failure lay entirely in the German understanding of the war they were fighting. The American supply lines stretching back to the coast were hundreds of miles long, famously choked by winter weather, destroyed bridges, and endless logistical bottlenecks. The central mystery of the resurrected tanks was never really about the thickness of a steel hull, the caliber of a weapon, or the courage of the crew inside. It was about a deeper, invisible system of sustainment. The opposing force had engineered weapons for a localized, decisive war, where a broken machine was a permanent casualty. The Allied forces had built an industrial ecosystem designed specifically to absorb, manage, and reverse destruction on a daily basis. The enemy could clearly see the terrifying tactical consequence, the relentless, suffocating pressure of an armored division that mathematically refused to die, but they could never comprehend the machinery producing it. Yet, to classify this system as a purely industrial or mechanical triumph ignores the brutal reality of how it actually functioned. Blueprints, standardized track pins, and heavy lifting cranes were entirely useless without the men tasked with forcing them together in the worst conditions imaginable. The true, sustaining strength of the American Armored Division did not reside safely in the pristine blast furnaces and assembly lines of Detroit. It resided in the freezing, waterlogged forests of Western Europe, powered by profound human exhaustion. The frontline mechanics, welders, and M32 recovery drivers fought a completely different war than the combat crews they supported. They did not fire the main guns or charge fortified concrete bunkers. No factory in Detroit could possibly ship a new tank to a muddy field in Western Germany in under 2 days. Their enemies were gravity, weather, and ruined steel. They suffered from severe frostbite, their bare hands slipping on ice-covered armor plate in the pitch black. They crushed their fingers between violently swaying 3,000-pound transmissions and hollow lower hulls. They routinely collapsed from sleep deprivation, working continuous 36-hour shifts beneath heavy canvas tarps, breathing in the toxic, choking fumes of arc welders, burnt cordite, and leaking hydraulic fluid. When an infantryman walked past a forward ordnance depot, he saw men whose coveralls were permanently stained, stiff with black grease, their faces painted in a thick, inescapable paste of dirt and oil. These were the unnamed laborers who physically dragged the armored division forward. They were the gravediggers who pulled the dead out of the kill zone, the battlefield surgeons who cut away the shattered armor, and the ruthless scavengers who stripped the unrecoverable casualties to save the rest of the fleet. Every time an American combat column rolled successfully past the rusting, abandoned husks of German armor, it was a direct testament to this unseen labor. The enemy tanks remained permanently trapped in the winter fields because they had no system to save them. The American tanks returned to the fight because a freezing mechanic in the dark refused to let them die. The sudden, inexplicable resurrection of this armored company completely defied the fundamental rules of wartime attrition. The defenders were looking at a mechanical impossibility. As the deep, rhythmic vibration of the advancing Shermans echoes across the valley floor once again, the German defenders brace for the inevitable impact. The tanks approaching the ridge bear the fresh, unpainted steel scars of hasty field welds. Their lower chassis are heavily caked in the freezing mud of the cannibalization yards. But their engines are running, their guns are loaded, and the tracks are moving forward. The tanks they had killed had returned to kill them. To comprehend how an entire armored force could step out of its own graveyard, we must first look closely at what the German gunners actually saw through their sights that afternoon. To understand why this defensive line ultimately collapsed, we first need to understand why they were so absolutely certain their math was correct. When an armor-piercing shell strikes a medium tank, the kinetic energy does not always trigger a catastrophic explosion. To the anti-tank gunner pulling the lanyard, a successful hit is defined by an immediate tactical result. The enemy vehicle stops moving and begins to do the math. For the past 3 hours, his anti-tank gunners have been locked in a grinding, chaotic exchange with an American armored battalion. The main gun falls silent, and the crew abandons the hull. Once the hatches open and the men run, the threat is neutralized. The gunner shifts his sights to the next target. In the heat of an engagement, the defenders do not have the luxury of performing a forensic damage assessment. They deal in the binary logic of survival. A tank is either actively fighting or it is dead. But in the American armored doctrine, dead was a highly specific, carefully measured technical term. The vast majority of battlefield casualties were not total losses. They were what ordnance officers classified as mobility kills or firepower kills. A high-velocity round that shattered a drive sprocket or severed a steel track would permanently halt a 30-ton Sherman in the mud. To the German infantryman watching from a trench, the tank was destroyed. To an American mechanic, it simply needed a new track block and a heavy wrench. Even penetrating hits that punched through the armor plate often left the engine, the transmission, and the heavy chassis entirely intact. This created a profound gap in perception between the opposing armies. The German military culture, particularly late in the war, placed immense psychological and propagandistic value on the kill count. Batteries were praised, and medals were awarded based on the cumulative tally of enemy hulls left smoking in a field. The muddy field below is heavily cratered and littered with the results of their work. Through the drifting smoke, the commander counts 14 Sherman tanks. This system encouraged officers to view every abandoned vehicle as a permanent subtraction from the enemy's ledger. They believed they were fighting a war of sheer attrition, gradually grinding the American armored formations down to zero through superior gunnery. They could not see that the American ledger was constantly rewriting itself. The United States Army did not view a disabled tank as a piece of battlefield debris. It viewed a disabled tank as a collection of highly valuable, pre-manufactured components temporarily trapped in the wrong location. If the hull had not brewed up into a molten, unrecoverable ruin, it was simply an asset awaiting retrieval. The German command structurally failed to account for this, because their own logistics were crumbling. If a Panther tank snapped an axle in a muddy German valley in late 1944, lacking spare parts and heavy prime movers, it was often abandoned and blown up by its own crew. They assumed the Americans faced the exact same fatalistic reality. The defenders believed they had won the battle of attrition because they fundamentally misunderstood what they had destroyed. They had not killed a company of tanks. They had temporarily paused them. But realizing a tank is mathematically repairable is not the same as actually repairing it. An immobilized Sherman is a 30-ton block of dead steel, permanently halted in the killing zone. Some are actively burning, sending thick, spiraling columns of oily black smoke into the overcast winter sky. Sitting in freezing mud, completely exposed to mortar fire, artillery barrages, and enemy patrols. Recognizing its mechanical value was only the first step. To understand how the division resurrected its strength, we must answer a more urgent, physical question. How do you drag 30 tons of dead weight out of a contested kill zone before the enemy realizes what you are doing? Night falls on the Roar River Valley. The temperature drops rapidly below freezing, turning the churned, waterlogged mud into a hardened, jagged crust. The front line falls into an uneasy quiet, punctuated only by the sudden hiss of an illumination flare or the distant, muffled thump of artillery. It is in this dangerous, freezing darkness that the armored division's recovery teams begin their work. These are the men of the forward ordnance maintenance detachments, operating specialized equipment built specifically for a battlefield covered in heavy debris. Their primary instrument is the M32 tank recovery vehicle. Built directly on the familiar lower chassis of a Sherman tank, the M32 strips away the fighting turret entirely. In its place sits a towering, fixed A-frame crane, an internal winch capable of pulling 60,000 pounds, and heavy exterior stowage for block and tackle. It is essentially a heavy-duty tow truck, heavily armored against shrapnel. Others sit silently in the mud, slumped at awkward angles. Through his optics, he can see the precise nature of the damage. Designed to survive the exact same kinetic environment that killed the tanks it is deployed to save. The recovery crews rarely operate in daylight. Approaching an immobilized tank while in the direct line of sight of enemy 88mm guns is a death sentence. Instead, they work entirely in the pitch black. The driver of the M32 navigates blindly, inching forward in low gear, relying on a dismounted ground guide walking ahead in the mud, feeling for the deep tracks left by the afternoon's assault. When the recovery vehicle finally backs up to the disabled Sherman, the most dangerous phase of the operation begins. There is no factory lighting or heavy machinery to assist the men on the ground. Mechanics work with freezing, grease-covered hands, relying heavily on muscle memory and shielded, red-lensed flashlights. They crawl beneath the damaged hull, often sinking into the freezing water of the crater, to locate the heavy steel towing pintles. Every movement is a calculated risk. The loud clank of a steel D-ring striking armor plate can carry across the quiet valley, instantly drawing a barrage of mortar fire from the German lines. A tank with a shattered track cannot simply be rolled away. Its broken steel treads will dig deeply into the earth. Tracks are severed and unspooled behind road wheels. Drive sprockets are shattered. Hulls bear the jagged, blackened scars of high-velocity 75mm armor-piercing shells, anchoring the 30-ton hull in place. The recovery crew must either muscle a temporary track block into position using crowbars and sledgehammers in the dark, or rig the thick steel towing cables to drag the deadweight like a massive, reluctant sled. Once the cables are locked into position, the M32's engine throttles up. The massive internal winch takes the strain. The inch-thick steel cable pulls taut, vibrating violently under immense tension. Slowly, agonizingly, the suction of the mud breaks. The disabled Sherman is pulled backward, sliding out of the crater, and dragged safely behind the ridgeline. This was the silent theft occurring while the German defenders huddled in their bunkers. The recovery crews methodically stripped the battlefield of its dead. They turned what the opposing force considered a permanent graveyard into a temporary holding area. When the dawn broke, the German gunners peered through their optics to admire their handiwork, only to find an empty, cratered field. The smoking wrecks they had confidently claimed as victories had simply vanished. But dragging 30 tons of shattered steel out of the mud does not put it back into the fight. A tank with a destroyed transmission or a gaping hole punched through its engine compartment remains completely useless, regardless of which side of the hill it sits on. To the German officers watching from the ridgeline, the visual evidence is absolute. 14 destroyed tanks represent the loss of a full medium tank company. Moving the vehicles out of the crosshairs was merely the extraction phase. The mechanics had secured the raw material, but they still needed to repair it. Where does a military force take a ruined armored vehicle when the nearest industrial factory is an ocean away? Just a few miles behind the artillery positions, hidden inside a dense pine forest or the sprawling courtyard of a ruined farm, the darkness is broken by the harsh, blue-white glare of arc welders. This is the forward Ordnance depot. It is not a factory of brick and glass, but a massive, modular industrial complex built on mud, canvas, and heavy trucks. The mechanics here operate under a distinct doctrine. If the front line is the slaughterhouse, the depot is the operating room. The military solved the problem of distance by fundamentally changing the definition of heavy maintenance. They did not send broken tanks back to a pristine facility in the rear. They pushed the facility directly to the broken tanks. The heavy ordnance maintenance companies operated as self-contained, mobile factory floors. They carried their own heavy-duty generators, air compressors, and specialized machine shops housed entirely inside the beds of 2.5-ton trucks. They brought lathes, drill presses, and oxyacetylene torches into the freezing rain. When an M32 recovery vehicle dragged a crippled Sherman into this perimeter, in the brutal, unforgiving arithmetic of armored warfare, the American battalion attempting to breach this specific sector has just been bled dry. It is now mathematically combat ineffective. The triage was immediate and ruthless. There was no time for delicate, time-consuming mechanical rebuilds. If a German, armor-piercing shell had shattered the transmission, the mechanics did not open the heavy steel gearbox to carefully replace the shattered gears. Instead, they unbolted the entire 3,000-pound transmission assembly. Using a heavy mobile crane, they lifted the ruined unit out of the lower hull, swung it into the mud, and dropped a completely fresh, pre-assembled transmission directly into the empty cavity. This was the core mechanism of the division's speed. The mechanics repaired by replacement. A massive task that might take a civilian rail yard weeks to complete was compressed into 12 hours of brutal physical labor. Men worked in overlapping shifts through the night, their knuckles bleeding against freezing steel, turning massive torque wrenches while completely exposed to the winter weather. If a high-velocity round had punched a neat, deadly hole through the side armor, welders simply cut a square of steel from a hopelessly destroyed vehicle and welded it. directly over the penetration. By dawn, the patched and repaired Sherman was fueled, loaded with fresh ammunition, and driven straight back to the line of departure. This forward echelon system was entirely invisible to the German defenders on the ridge. They assumed a heavily damaged tank was